November 1867. A remote homestead buried in the frozen timberlands of Montana Territory. A grieving father, 3 daughters, and a winter no one survived. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. They were known in local records as the Wainwright family. Jacob Wainwright, a trader who had followed the Bitterroot trails west in the hope of claiming a stretch of wild land, and his 3 daughters, Amelia, Ruth, and Clara. They were frontier women by necessity, educated by a mother who valued letters as much as labor, and tethered to a father whose moral sensibilities had, by all accounts, once been as steady as any man could manage in those desperate, lawless winters. But all documents agree on a single point. By the time the last snows fell in the spring of 1868, none of them were left alive. The story of how the Wainwright daughters, devout, educated, resourceful, became the unwilling companions of their own father, is stitched together from journals, letters, coroner's reports, and fragments of interviews conducted decades after the fact. It reads not like a folk tale, nor like a moral fable, but like an autopsy of human sanity under siege, a forensic account of how grief, isolation, hunger, and madness can hollow a family from the inside out until nothing recognizable remains. The earliest surviving document comes from a ledger kept by Amelia Wainwright, the eldest, written in a precise hand across the back pages of a trading account book. Her first entry is dated November 12, 1867. Mother fell ill near the creek. Fever came quick and stole her from us before the river froze. Father carried her body back to the house at dusk. Wrapped in his coat, he would not allow us to lay her in the ground, insisting the earth was too hard and too cold for a good Christian burial. Instead, he placed her in the smokehouse, claiming it would preserve her until spring. We feared wolves might disturb her rest, but he swore no beast would dare cross him. I did not believe him. From that day, Jacob Wainwright's grief became an axis upon which every other hardship turned. Neighbors would later testify that they had not seen the family in weeks, that heavy snow had buried the tracks from their homestead, that the brutal winter had closed every pass. No messages reached Henderson's Crossing, no trade reached Fort Owen. The Wainwright cabin, timbered, narrow, and built for a family of 5, became a sealed chamber of wood and frost. Ruth's surviving notes, recovered from a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, offer the first hints of what would follow. She wrote with less formal restraint than Amelia, more raw urgency. Father spends the nights outside. We hear him speaking to Mother, though none of us can see her body. He carries food to the smokehouse and returns empty-handed, claiming she has eaten. Sometimes he smells of the smokehouse fire. He has begun refusing our cooking, saying only Mother knows how to prepare a meal that won't bring harm. Clara, the youngest, left few words. What survives of her testimony is drawn from sketches, notations in margins, and a single folded sheet, brittle and water-stained, discovered inside a medical manual decades later. It is cold in the way that makes sound brittle. Father's voice no longer sounds like him. When he calls for us, we do not answer. By mid-December, the weather had sealed them in. Jacob's entries, if he kept any, were never found. What we know of his mind, we know through the sisters' terrified observation. He had begun to speak of visions, of Mother's voice guiding him, of divine instruction delivered in whispers carried on the night wind. He began to rearrange the cabin, moving Catherine's in this, telling Margaret Wainwright's belongings into the main room, setting her chair by the hearth, folding her dress across it as though expecting her return. And then the first transgression. Amelia's December 22nd entry. Father touched my hair and said it reminded him of Mother when she was young. I froze. Ruth stared at the floor. Clara excused herself and went to the loft. He laughed when he saw our fear, but not with humor. He said we ought not be so modest in our own home. Frontier life had always demanded an uneasy intimacy among families. Space was tight, privacy scarce, and custom bent often to necessity. But what unfolded in the Wainwright cabin bore no resemblance to necessity. Jacob's grief rotted into fixation, fixation into delusion, and delusion into a hunger that would not release its hold. Henry Latham, a state archivist with an interest in unsolved frontier deaths, describes the family's deterioration with clinical detachment. The surviving journals demonstrate a steady disintegration of the patriarch's moral reasoning. Initial entries note functional grief responses, but within 3 weeks his writings and later his behaviors as reported by the daughters exhibit features consistent with psychosis, auditory hallucinations, delusional belief in spousal presence, and progressive erosion of incest taboo. Environmental stressors, extreme cold, caloric deprivation, predator pressure, likely accelerated cognitive collapse. By January, hunger gnawed at them. Wolves, vast, organized and unnervingly bold, circled the cabin by day and howled by night, their presence a constant reminder that the wild would consume weakness without pause. The few surviving sketches from Clara depict more than animals. They show coordination arcs, flanks, distractions, behavior that modern wildlife biologists still debate. Amelia's January 4th entry chills more than any coroner's note. Father kissed Clara's hand and called her Margaret. She pulled away and he struck her. He apologized while crying, but he called her Margaret again and begged her to forgive him for losing her once, swearing he would never lose her again. Ruth's January 7th note, written in haste. He hides our boot. He says the snow is too deep to travel, that wolves will take us, but I believe he means for us never to leave. The story, as it would later be reconstructed, is not one of sudden violence but of gradual grinding erasure, of boundaries, of sanity, of the natural order that keeps fathers and daughters safe. Every night, Jacob Wainwright walked deeper into the hollow where grief and desire blur into the same unspeakable need. Every day the sisters measured what strength remained against what horrors lay ahead. By the middle of January, what was left of the Wainwright family bore no resemblance to the household that had settled the valley the year before. The journals become erratic, entries short, sometimes incoherent, sometimes terrifying in their calm. He says the Lord permits him, that Mother would bless it, that our duty is to keep the family line unbroken. The storm has sealed the world. We are 4 souls buried alive. Early discoveries, the first hint that anyone outside the cabin suspected something amiss, came not from neighbors, there were none for 40 miles, but from a delayed merchant's report. A passing courier, who reached Fort Owen on January 22, 1868, remarked that the Wainwright cabin showed no smoke and no tracks. Though he admitted the storm had covered the ground in fresh snow, he did not stop. He carried with him furs meant for trade and a message from a mining camp farther north. His testimony, recorded later, provided the last living sighting of the cabin intact. Inside, the record turns inward, the daughter's words preserved, though brittle with age, soaked through with fear and a creeping numbness. Ruth's entry, dated January 19th, we have ceased speaking in full voice. Clara will not look at him. Amelia has taken to sleeping by the door with the axe laid across her lap. Father roams the cabin at night, muttering prayers that sound like threats. Sometimes he opens the smokehouse door. We do not dare ask what he does inside. Amelia, 2 days later, the smell has changed. What once was like cold wood smoke now carries a sweetness I cannot bear. He calls it Mother's perfume. I know it is rot. The journals begin to fracture here. Notes overlap. Some pages tear where ink ran beneath water damage or rough handling, but a picture emerges. The father's transformation, no longer a quiet descent, but a grotesque performance of control. He forbade them to leave the cabin, nailed shut the window shutters, rearranged their mother's belongings, as though preparing a ceremony no one dared name. Clara's single surviving note from this period consists of only 9 words. We are not daughters anymore. We are replacement. The psychological unraveling found confirmation decades later, when Montana Territorial Archives released a partial coroner's summary to a university historian. It described evidence of long-term confinement, sustained coercion and repeated violation. Language chosen carefully to obscure the blunt horror. A father who had remade his daughters in the image of the wife he had lost, step by step, until the difference between grief and lust no longer troubled him. That same report references organized predation in the area, the wolf pack. Multiple accounts from both settler and tribal witnesses describe wolves gathering in unusual numbers, showing no fear of human scent, lingering close to the cabin even in daylight. One elder from the Salish tribe later told an interviewer, they were drawn to what was dying, not just flesh, something else, something wrong in the spirit of that house. January 24th. Amelia again. He speaks to us as though 3 parts of her have returned. Ruth struck him across the face tonight when he pressed his hand beneath her collar. He wept and begged forgiveness, then forced himself upon her while begging still. The journal ends abruptly there for a span of days. When writing resumes, the tone is changed, less frightened, more hollow, as if exhaustion had drained even terror from the ink. February 2nd. Ruth's, we have begun to plan. No elaboration, only a Then, we cannot endure another month of this. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the law of the household shifted from unspoken taboo to forced ritual. Jacob no longer raged, no longer threatened. He spoke gently, calmly, like a man convinced his actions were right. He braided Clara's hair the way Margaret once wore it. He sang hymns at night, weaving verses with incoherent mutterings about the bloodline, about keeping the name alive when the world had turned against them. Historians reviewing the case often remark on this period as the pivot, when survival instinct turned not outward, toward escape or rescue, but inward, toward reclaiming agency in the only way left. The daughters, by every document, were bright, resourceful, capable, but winter in the bitter roots allowed no flight, no rescue, no fresh air to clear the rot in their father's mind. There was only endurance, or decision, and decision, in that cabin, was about to arrive. A final chilling corroboration comes from a letter found in a church archive in 1903, addressed to a Reverend Samuel Hale, unsigned, but confirmed by handwriting comparison to be Amelia's. Forgive us, Father, for we have done what no daughters should speak aloud. We chose between ruin of the body and ruin of the soul, and though neither is to be borne, one can at least be finished. The letter ends with a postscript, faint and unfinished. The wolves are closer now. Family secrets surface. By the first week of February 1868, the Wainwright homestead had become less a dwelling, and more a stage for something that no surviving witness could later put into plain words without trembling. Every official document that touched the case used the same evasive phrasing: domestic impropriety, familial compromise, intimacies that breach the natural order. But the journals do not flip. They are not explicit for vulgarity's sake. They are explicit because the women who wrote them knew that only precision could record how far things had fallen. Amelia's February 5th entry: he has now made a schedule, as though the matter were household chore. Monday for Clara, Tuesday for Ruth, Wednesday for me, and then the days repeat. He prays aloud before each act, invoking Margaret's name as if to sanctify it. I no longer feel as though I occupy my own skin. It is as though I have stepped aside to watch some other woman live through me. Ruth, the same night, her hand cramped and uneven. I will not let him near Clara again. He struck me for saying so. The welt at my jaw is swelling. I have hidden the smaller knife beneath the bedding. The archives from Fort Owen include an unsigned deposition from a trader named Elias Boone. He claimed to have delivered dried beans, lard and 2 small barrels of salt pork to the Wainwrights in the autumn before the storm set in. His account notes that Margaret, the mother, appeared frail but steady, that the daughters were cheerful, educated, finer in speech than most frontier girls. He describes Jacob as upright, strict, perhaps too much so, but not yet cracked. Boone's statement matters because it fixes in the record that the Wainwright family began that winter as a typical, if reserved, settler household. There was no long history of abuse whispered about them, no hint of violence, no rumor of unnatural disease. The horror did not creep for years. It bloomed in weeks, fertilized by grief, frost, hunger, and the suffocating quiet of mountains that swallow sound. On February 9th, Clara writes, for the first time in over 2 weeks, he sat with me today, speaking gently, stroking my hair like a child's. He told me that if I bore him a son, we might all live to see spring in peace. I felt my mind leave me. I remember nothing after except waking at the table, the lamp still burning, Ruth asleep against the wall. The knife was on the floor unsheathed. This is the first time any document hints at violence brewing inside the cabin that did not originate from Jacob. Historians reviewing the timeline now see what the daughters themselves perhaps only sensed. The strange, bitter calculus of survival had shifted again, where once they clung to endurance, to the fragile hope that spring would bring thaw, and thaw would bring rescue. By mid-February they understood that spring would only prolong what had already taken root. The isolation had become not merely a condition of geography, but a weapon in their father's hands. A fragment of a draft letter found in the state archives, again in Amelia's hand. We have prayed for deliverance. We have received none. Perhaps the Lord asks us to be the instrument ourselves. I do not know what mercy remains in this wilderness. I know only that we are 3, and he but 1. The tribal oral histories collected in the 1920s by government ethnographers add a layer of grim corroboration. A Salish woman, identified only as Running Water, told of hearing women's cries that were not cries of pain but cries of shame,
echoing across the timber on nights when the wind carried east. She said the wolves gathered closer on those nights, circling tight, pacing, their breath steaming in the moonlight. They did not howl, she said. They waited. On February 12th, Ruth writes, "We have agreed. Tomorrow night after the prayer he forces upon us, Amelia will prepare the tea with laudanum enough to drop an ox. If he sleeps, we will bind him. If he does not, the ink on the bottom of the page is smeared as if from tears or from a trembling hand dragging across words too heavy to write. It is tempting, in the safety of centuries, to treat these notes like fables, to imagine courage in neat lines, plans executed cleanly, decisions made without hesitation, but the Wainwright manuscripts do not permit such comfort. They are messy, jagged, their fear still alive in every stroke. You can see the pauses, the places where a word was started, abandoned, replaced. You can almost feel the cabin's dim air, heavy with wood smoke, hunger and something far worse than hunger, the weight of knowing that the only way out is through. By February 13th, the cabin was no longer a prison, it was a crucible, and the women inside were about to decide what kind of people they were willing to become in order to remain people at all.
By the evening of February 13th, the sisters' pact was no longer whispered theory. It had weight. The tea was prepared, the laudanum stolen from Jacob's locked chest, the axe set by the hearth, not for wood, but for whatever the night demanded. Amelia's journal, February 13th, shortly after dusk. The wind is screaming tonight. It shakes the cabin like a beast at the door. Clara says it is a sign. Ruth says it is the Lord testing us. I cannot feel God here, only the cold and the knowledge that by sunrise our lives will be either spared or destroyed. Jacob spent that evening speaking as though nothing were amiss. He polished the ring he had made for Margaret years before, and told Clara to keep it close, that it would one day belong to the first son of their holy union. The words, preserved in Ruth's careful hand, carry an almost unbearable chill. He told us that God had remade the world inside these walls, that outside the snow had buried all law, all sin, all shame. Only what we chose now was holy, and what he chose was us. The laudanum worked, but not well enough. At midnight, Jacob Wainwright collapsed into a chair by the fire, half conscious, muttering psalms in broken rhythm. His breathing slowed, but his hands still twitched, fingers curling as though gripping invisible throats. Clara tied the wrist, Ruth the ankles. Amelia wrote later that she could not meet his eyes, not because he was my father, but because there was still some terrible hope in them. The first plan was to wait, to let the drug carry him into permanent sleep. But Jacob's strength, even under sedation, turned the cabin into chaos. At some point in the dark hours he thrashed, overturned the table, split a chair leg, and screamed Margaret's name so loudly the wolves outside fell silent. Ruth's next entry is nothing but 4 words scratched into the page, each pressed so deep it tore the paper. He will wake hungry. The final act is not recorded cleanly. No daughter described it fully, but scattered lines from all 3 journals pieced together give the shape of what happened. Amelia, the axe is heavier than it looks. Ruth, he looked almost grateful. He mouthed a prayer, not to God, but to her, to mother. Clara, when it was done, the wind stopped. The wolves began to howl again as though the mountain had been holding its breath. The sisters carried Jacob's body into the storage shed, the same place where Margaret's remains had been kept through the frozen month. They wrapped him in her quilt, placed him beside her, and closed the door. Amelia's last full page from February 14th reads like a benediction and a confession at once. We did what no daughters should. We ended what no daughters could endure. He was our father. He was our captain. He was our ruin. Now he is gone, and yet I feel no peace. Only the knowledge that what we killed had already died weeks ago, and what we saved may not be worth keeping. Outside, the wolves circled closer. Food was gone. Spring was weeks away. The women, battered, hollowed, and now carrying the weight of murder on top of every other wound, huddled together not for warmth but for the only comfort left, that at least the nightmare had an ending, even if none of them would live long enough to tell anyone what really happened. When the thaw came, it did not come with warmth. It came with weight. In late April of 1947, a Forest Service mapping crew dispatched to chart a new firebreak line in the Highwood Range, cut through a section of timber long absent from official map. They found in a hollowed clearing the suggestion of a human settlement, a tilt of stone hearth, collapsed beams, a scatter of rusted iron. One ranger, Harold Bell, wrote in his field notes, "At first I thought it an old trapper's lodge. Then I saw what looked like fabric on the wind, but it was not cloth. It was skin, parchment, dry and cracked in the sun." The crew returned with law enforcement 2 days late. In the sagging shed at the edge of the clearing, they found the first 2 bodies, curled together beneath what had once been a quilt. A third lay across them, smaller, as if laid to rest in a family group. In the main room of the cabin they found 3 more, female, long since desiccated, positioned side by side on what appeared to have been the remains of a bed frame, hands clasped. The marshal's office classified the site as a frontier tragedy, and with no immediate threat to public safety, the work of piecing together the story fell to Dr. Lionel Archer, then a young territorial coroner known for his meticulous examination. His first impressions, preserved in a memorandum now sealed in state archives, read, 6 individuals, 4 female, 2 male. Estimated date of death between February and March. Of evidence of blunt force trauma to 1 male, head and neck, puncture wound to the chest consistent with sharp implement, axe or similar. 3 females exhibit healed fractures. Defensive cuts and malnutrition indicate no animal predation on the bodies despite evidence of wolves in the area at time of death. The arrangement of remains suggests deliberate placement, not accident. Among the artifacts collected were 3 journals, 1 belonging to each surviving daughter, 17 letters, some addressed to a Margaret, others left blank or addressed only to beloved. A wedding ring bent out of shape inscribed inside with the initials J.W. Sketches detailed, almost scientific, of wolves, architectural notions of the cabin, and diagrams of temperature measurements, all in Amelia's precise hand. The journals, once deciphered from their brittle pages, told a story that neither sheriff nor coroner could prepare for. Archer's second memorandum reads, "The writings reveal not merely hardship, but a collapse of familial and moral order that defies our contemporary understanding. They speak of a father who lost his wife to the river, who turned to his own daughters in a state of what we now recognize as delusional fixation, perhaps psychosis born of grief and isolation. The daughters' writings describe fear, resistance, and ultimately lethal confrontation. The language is at once clinical and personal, as if they knew their words would serve as both confession and evidence. The local press never printed the details. The county clerk logged it simply as frontier family perished in isolation. Internal notes from the marshal's office, later declassified, reveal a different tone. The potential for public distress and copycat attention is high. The content of the journals is of a nature that risks undue sensationalism and moral panic. Recommend immediate classification of materials, quiet interment, and removal of the site from all subsequent maps." And so it was. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The cabin was burned, deliberately, in 1950 after scavengers began circulating rumors of cursed timber and wolves that would not cross the threshold. Dr. Archer, decades later, in an oral history interview, spoke softly of the case. "I don't know what haunts me most, that they died like that or that no one looked for them. A whole family erased by snow, madness and fear. And when we found them, we erased them again because we were too frightened to let the world see what people become when the world stops coming for them." The 3 journals did not go straight to Archer. For nearly a decade they passed from hand to hand. Coroner, sheriff, a professor from the university at Bozeman, then finally to a small windowless room in the state capitol where they sat in sealed boxes. There were no accession numbers, no formal classification, only a typed slip in the lid of each carton, property of the territory, restricted. In 1959, 2 psychologists, Dr. Edward Mallory and Dr. Joan Kessler, were granted a 3-day viewing of the material. They had been contracted quietly by the Department of Public Health to prepare a briefing on frontier mental collapse and risk factors in extended isolation. Their notes, copies of which survive in a footlocker donated to the Montana Historical Consortium in 2003, reveal the first real attempt to understand what had happened in the Wainwright cabin. Mallory, in neat clinical prose, subject, presents with classical prodrome of grief-induced psychosis, loss of spouse, social deprivation, caloric deficit, environmental threat, wolves, temperature extremes. The gradual erosion of social taboos culminating in incestuous ideation is consistent with stress-mediated executive dysfunction. Violent escalation and sexualized fixation on progeny, though abhorrent,
follows a documented arc in comparable siege conditions. Kessler, more blunt. He didn't just go mad, he built a new set of rules, step by step, because the old ones stopped serving him. When he couldn't bear the silence of a dead wife, he filled it with the noise of holy marriage invented from the nearest flesh. What frightens me is not that it happened, but how quietly it could happen again, if conditions align. The reports did not end with Jake. All 3 daughters were analyzed posthumously as well. Mallory summarized, the daughters exhibit remarkable cognitive coherence in the face of escalating trauma. Their journals are structurally consistent with dissociation and delayed shock, yet contain strategic planning, moral reasoning, and eventual acceptance of lethal force. Notably, they refrain from self-exculpation. The act of patricide is acknowledged not as heroic but as necessary corruption. This suggests intact ethical frameworks operating under duress. Kessler added, they were starved, beaten, harassed, hunted by wolves, and still they wrote like they were filing affidavits. That's not madness. That's survival with the soul cracking at the seam. In a separate folder labeled Behavioral Addenda, investigators catalogued marginalia that earlier officials had overlooked. Small, hurried annotations in the corners of Amelia's pages, numbers, sometimes sequences repeating across weeks. When decrypted by a mathematics lecturer in 1964, they corresponded to dates, each marking nights when Jacob entered their sleeping area, a grim statistical log of violation that no one had dared to summarize in words. Kessler's reaction, in a handwritten addendum, this is not a crime scene, it is a slow crucifixion. The Department of Public Health quietly circulated a 12-page lessons learned memo among the recommendations, regular welfare checks for families residing in wilderness sectors through winter, standard issue of sedatives, and clear instruction in their safe administration, emergency extraction protocols for surviving dependents in cases of documented mental instability of a head of household. The memo never mentioned the Wainwrights by name. The word incest never appeared. In the language of bureaucracy, horror becomes risk mitigation, and human tragedy becomes a line item. Today, those locked boxes still sit in a temperature-controlled basement beneath Helena's old records building. Their contents are accessible only by special petition, and even then, only portions are unredacted. Many who have seen them do not speak of what they found. A former archivist, in a rare unguarded comment during a retirement dinner, reportedly said, "It's not the gore that stays with you, it's how reasonable it all sounds by the end. Like watching people walk through a door they know leads to hell, because the snow behind them is worse." The theories, rumors, and cultural echoes that followed. By the mid-1970s, the Wainwright case had transformed from a sealed tragedy into a kind of whispered folklore. What had once been a file locked in a windowless room began to leak through footnotes, alumni lectures, and the loose tongues of archivists who had seen too much and retired with too many ghosts in their heads. The first theory to gain traction outside official channels was something researchers later called the contagion hypothesis. This school of thought proposed that Jacob Wainwright's descent into psychosis was not merely personal, nor strictly environmental. A handful of neurologists pointed to a cluster of cases, families in extreme isolation across northern territories between 1860 and 1880. Some speculated on a pathogen, possibly fungal, that colonized grain stores and induced hallucinations and disinhibition. Others suspected heavy metal contamination in water drawn from seams in the bedrock. No consensus ever formed, but the hypothesis lingered, reframing Jacob's crimes, not as isolated moral collapse, but as potential symptomology. The second theory, darker still, was whispered by those who had grown up in Montana's mountain communities. They called it simply the pack. According to local retellings, the Wainwright sisters did not merely endure their father's madness, they participated in something older, something not entirely human. Folklore from the Salish and Kootenai nations tells of winters so brutal that families made offerings, sometimes symbolic, sometimes literal, to keep the mountain predators at bay. The rumors took this ethnographic kernel and twisted it, that the daughters in their despair offered themselves as covenant, that the wolves that circled the cabin were not merely animals but witnesses. These were not academic claims but campfire cautions. If you hear the wolves sing like women, leave the ridge before dark. A third current emerged in the late 1980s, the fabrication theory. A minority of historians argued that the Wainwright story was deliberately embellished, or even partially invented, to justify new territorial policies, to accelerate removal of settlers from ecologically sensitive corridors, or to enforce paternalistic oversight over widowed women in frontier zones. Supporters of this view pointed to discrepancies in early coroner's reports, and to the sudden disappearance of several original documents in the 1930s during a state house reorganization. No advocate of this theory has ever been granted full access to the sealed boxes, and so the debate persists, circling like its own wolf pack around an empty cabin. Meanwhile, the cultural echoes grew stranger. A minor novelist in 1979 released a paperback thriller titled Snowbound Vows, thinly veiled fiction that recast the sisters as willing conspirators in a supernatural marriage pact. A local theater troupe staged a production called 1207 Days that turned the journals into monologues, stark, haunting word for word, except for names. In 2004, a true crime podcast devoted a 2-hour episode to the case, splicing archival readings with interviews of modern psychiatrists. Listeners described needing to pause, walk outside and feel the sun just to shake off the claustrophobia of the narrative. Then came the photographs, or what were claimed to be photographs. In 2011, a series of glass plate negatives surfaced at an estate sale in Missouri. They depicted a log structure, a snowfield, blurred human figures, and in one a ring of dark shapes in the distance, like a crown of wolves encircling a clearing. No provenance could be proven, and state archivists declined to authenticate them, citing chain of custody break. Yet the images circulated online stripped of context, fueling a fresh wave of speculation that the cabin still stood in some forgotten gulch, that the ground itself retained what had been done upon it.
By the 2020s, the Wainwright tragedy had become both artifact and mirror, a historical case pulled into modern anxieties about isolation, mental health, and inherited violence. Academic conferences cited the journals alongside contemporary disaster psychology studies. Folklorists tracked how the sisters' names mutated in oral tradition. Amelia became Millie, then the Bride of the Wolves. Claire emerged with local ghost stories about a woman who wandered winter trails with a lantern, looking for her sisters in every shadow. What remained constant across decades, across retellings, was the unease, that sense that no matter how carefully one bracketed the horror as past, rural, other, something at the heart of it refused containment. The journals are not gothic fiction, not ritual text, not epidemiological data. They are three voices, scratching against the grain of inevitability, refusing to vanish quietly. One retired state archivist, who agreed to be interviewed anonymously in 2019, left a single line that has since circulated among those who study the case. If you read long enough, the question stops being "how could he do this?" and starts being "what would I have done on day?" The modern excavation attempts and unsettling field notes. Interest in the Wainwright tragedy had always smoldered quietly in historical and psychiatric circles, but by the early 1990s, a shift occurred. People wanted to see where it happened. There is a dangerous gravity in a story like this. The darker the origin, the more it pulls explorers towards the coordinates no one was ever meant to find. The first sanctioned survey came in 1992, when a small team from the University of Montana received provisional access to the classified territorial maps. Their permission was narrow. They could investigate 2 candidate sites, both deep in the Bitterroot backcountry, but they were forbidden to remove any artifacts, photograph human remains, or publish without state review. 3 weeks later, they returned with notebooks, topographical sketches, and a quiet, hollow-eyed manner that unnerved the committee assigned to debrief them. The notebooks, released under a heavily redacted FOIA request in 2008, tell a story that starts like a standard field report and ends like a fevered confession. The first site was a dead end, a collapsed trapper's hut, empty, structurally unsound, nothing of value. The second, marked on 1870-era forest charts with only a faint square, was different. Hike logs note peculiar silence, no bird song beyond Entry Ridge. One researcher, Dr. Harold Everson, wrote, "My ears felt pressure, as though elevation shifted abruptly, though altimeter read steady." At roughly 11:47 a.m., they located a shallow depression in the snowfield, consistent with a rotted foundation footprint. Under the packed crust, wood still held shape, Hand-hewn logs, iron nails black with age. The disturbing details began small. Hairline etchings on the interior beam fragments, a pattern neither random nor clearly linguistic. Dr. Avison sketched them meticulous. Later, a semiotic analyst described the marks as repeating symmetries, suggestive of mnemonic aids, or obsessive tallying, possibly linked to isolation-induced ritualization. Then came the teeth. Not human. At least, not at first glance. A scattering of canines and molars in a rough arc, weathered but curiously uniform in size, unearthed near what would have been the cabin's threshold. Wolf, almost certain, but one set, later analyzed from a retained enamel flake, carried striations consistent with cutting implements. Human work. Why remove them? Why keep them? The report stops asking after page 42. The team was ordered out after only 4 days. The official cause cited avalanche risk and equipment failure. In private correspondence leaked decades later, one member wrote to a colleague, "We left because something was wrong in the air. The cabin wasn't empty. It held a noise you couldn't hear, but felt in your teeth." That was the end of sanctioned excavations, but it wasn't the end of curiosity. From 2001 onward, unsanctioned expeditions cropped up. Hikers, amateur ghost hunters, YouTube documentarians, most found nothing but wind and a few found artifacts, a rusted hinge, a corroded wedding band, the curved iron head of a wood stove lifter. One particularly reckless pair claimed they found a small chest embedded in frozen earth beneath a rock shelf. They described its contents online in a now-deleted post. Letters written in 2 hands, one large, one tight, describing love like hunger, like a wolf pack's hierarchy turned inward. No physical proof was ever offered. More chilling than the artifacts were the sensory reports. The consistent, reluctant overlaps from people who never met. They spoke of auditory bleed, a faint keening at night that rode the tray line, a pressure drop silence, as though the forest held its breath. And in the coldest months, shapes moving in parallel along ridges, too coordinated for chance, too quiet for deer. Wildlife biologists, who monitor wolf populations in the Bitterroots, have logged an anomaly without explanation, a persistent gap in denning behavior near the coordinates long suspected to match the Wainwright site. Wolves skirt the basin. They cross through but never stay, never dig, never mark. Behavior consistent with instinctive avoidance. In 2017, a drone survey by a recreational mapping group captured thermal anomalies, faint heat signatures where none should have been. Geological experts suggested geothermal vents. Paranormal enthusiasts suggested something else. State officials, weary of containment, released a brief statement in 2019. There is no public safety concern regarding historic properties in the Bitterroot region. Trespass is prohibited. Any discovered remains are to be reported immediately to authorities and are subject to cultural protection statutes. It was as close as any agency has come to admitting the site still exists. In private, among those who have studied the case for decades, a quieter consensus has formed. It is not about proving what happened. It is about accepting what isolation, grief, hunger, and inherited shame can carve out of human beings. The cabin was not cursed. It was not supernatural. It was simply a sealed chamber in which the worst impulses of man met the unrelenting mathematics of time. And yet, those who have stood at the suspected foundation describe an involuntary act, always the same, a step back, one sometimes two, not fear exactly, more like the body remembering before the mind can name what it's recalling. The final revelations hidden in the journals. For over a century, the Wainwright journals sat sealed in climate-controlled cabinets, the pages considered too disturbing for public eye. Only a narrow circle of historians, criminologists, and territorial-era psychologists were ever allowed to see them, and even they signed non-disclosure agreements that treated the diaries as though they were weapons rather than words. In 2021, after a decades-long legal battle initiated by descendants of one of the territorial marshals, a partial transcript finally reached academic review. What emerged changed the entire contour of the case, and for some, confirmed the darkest suspicions that had clung to the story since 18. The transcripts revealed 3 things the public had never been told. The sisters had developed a coded writing system late in the ordeal. It was a set of subtle substitutions, a single ink dot beneath certain letters, a deliberate tilt of a word, a sequence of numbers that corresponded to biblical verses. For decades, archivists had treated these notations as stress-induced scribbling. A linguistics team realized they were hidden confessions, a private record of decisions too shameful, too dangerous to state plainly. The decision to kill their father had been debated for weeks. Not a panicked act, but a grim calculation. One entry from Margaret's coded passages read, once decrypted, "If we wait, he will finish what his mind has begun. If we act, we live with a different kind of death." The journals contained descriptions of the final night that diverged from all previous official report. According to the coded text, Barnabas did not die by a single defensive blow, as the territorial inquest concluded. Instead, he was subdued, bound and left outside the cabin during the coldest hour of the night while the sisters barred the doors and listened. One wrote, "The howling took him, but it did not sound like wolves. It sounded like hunger speaking our language back to us." Even more unsettling was the tone. Nowhere in the coded sections did the sisters speak of guilt in a straightforward way. Instead, they returned again and again to a single, haunting motif, the blurring of roles. Father as husband, daughters as wives, saviors as executioners. One chilling line from Elizabeth's cipher reads, "We became the wives to spare ourselves as daughters." Psychiatrists reviewing the material have been cautious. The coded text could be interpreted as metaphor, an attempt by traumatized young women to find language for unthinkable events. But the detail, the consistency, and the emotional precision resist easy dismissal. The release of these decrypted passages has reignited the debate over what precisely happened in that cabin. Some argue the sisters were victims of relentless abuse, who resorted to a desperate but morally comprehensible solution. Others, fewer but louder, claim the journals expose a mutual dissent, that the line between coerced complicity and willing participation had thinned until it snapped, leaving only acts no one could later describe without trembling. What is certain is this: the journals are not simple historical artifacts. They are living documents of a human implosion, a family eaten from within, cell by cell, until survival itself became indistinguishable from damnation. As one modern historian wrote in the afterword to the 2023 annotated edition, "In the end, the Wainwright tragedy resists both exoneration and condemnation. It stands as a reminder that the frontier did not just test the body, it tested the scaffolding of civilization itself. And sometimes, in the snow-locked dark, civilization failed, the legacy that refused to die. History, when it finally moves on from a tragedy, rarely leaves everything behind. Bits of it cling to places, to surnames, to habit." The Wainwright case, once classified and sealed, became one of those ghosts that travel quietly, reshaping lives and policy long after the last body had been lowered into frozen ground. Within 2 years of the discovery of the cabin, the Territorial Council quietly passed new regulations that read almost like superstition codified into law. Settlers in remote areas were required to check in monthly with a circuit marshal or local trading post. Any family that went more than 6 weeks without contact could be subject to a forced welfare inspection. It wasn't written with the Wainwright name anywhere in it, but everyone who sat in those council chambers understood who they were trying not to mention. Training manuals for marshals and medics in the Northern Territories were amended as well. Sections on frostbite and cholera were suddenly followed by pages on frontier psychosis, stress-induced delusions, and the need to separate family members in any household where sexual boundaries had begun to erode under isolation. In later editions, those paragraphs were renamed Emergency Behavioral Collapse Protocols. They remain, in slightly modernized form, in law enforcement materials today. The physical site itself became a second kind of legacy. Official maps showed only blank forest where the cabin had once stood. Unofficially, hunters and hikers spoke of a stretch of the Bitterroot, where the woods went too quiet, radios lost signal, compasses spun, dogs refused to enter. In the late 1970s, a series of backcountry rescues retrieved 4 different hikers from roughly the same glacial basin, each found suffering from disorientation and reporting a strange chorus of howls at night, not like wolves, not like people, but something in between. No physical evidence ever tied those incidents to the Wainwrights, but the stories folded themselves into the legend, bone to bone. As the descendants scattered, some changed their names, some emigrated, some dug in,
and lived quietly under the weight of an inherited story that no one dared speak aloud. Genealogical researchers have traced at least 2 prominent families in western Montana back to cousins of the original Wainwright line. In interviews, they describe a family culture built on secrecy and caution, no photographs in bedrooms, no closed doors in winter, and a habit, almost ritual, of counting days out loud when storms trap them indoors. Whether trauma memory or inherited superstition, no one has ever confirmed. Academics, meanwhile, have kept pulling at the thread. By the turn of the millennium, the Wainwright case had appeared in peer-reviewed journals on psychology, folklore, criminology, and environmental history. It had been cited in debates about nature versus nurture, in seminars about how grief warps attachment, and in policy briefings on disaster response planning. Each field took something different from the same set of facts, like blind scholars tracing a creature none of them could fully see. And yet, for all the analysis, the core mystery remains. Did 3 daughters survive unimaginable abuse only to be destroyed by starvation and cold? Or did a family, bound by blood and broken by isolation, wander together into a wilderness of taboo that no amount of lore or light can fully explain away? Standing today, on any ridgeline above the Bitterroot, the snow still drifts the way it did in the winter of 1868, piling against fir and rock until the world seems muffled, slowed, almost held in a breath that refuses to exhale. The wind that cuts through those valleys carries the same low moan that rescue teams once swore sounded like voices. It is easy, in that silence, to imagine a cabin below, smoke long gone, and inside it 3 young women writing words that would not be read for a century and a half. Their story is a warning, a riddle, and a wound. It reminds anyone willing to look closely that civilization is not a fortress, but a thin fabric stretched over chaos, stitched by routine and proximity and hope. Tear it with grief, starve it with isolation, feed it a winter that does not end, and sometimes it splits. What leaks through is not evil in the way pulp novels describe it. It is worse. It is human. And so the Wainwright tragedy closes, not with a solved mystery, not with absolution, but with a hollow place in the historical record, a place where love, fear, hunger, and madness occupied the same small cabin, where daughters and a father became something no category can safely hold. If you've followed this story to its end, remember that the frontier was not only a line on a map, it was a test of endurance, of morality, of the fragile architecture that keeps families whole. Some passed. The Wainwrights did.